Good evening. My name is Stephen Madsen. I'm the president of North Saskatchewan River Valley Conservation Society. Welcome and thank you for attending. Tonight's event will begin with a presentation by our guest speaker, a talk titled Dark Days at Noon, The Future of Fire, something that's very relevant. Ed Struzik is a fellow at Queen's Institute for Energy and Environmental Policy and a regular contributing writer to Yale Environment 360, an international online magazine published by the Yale School of the Environment. He is the author of two books on wildfire, Firestorm, How Wildfire Will Shape Our Future from 2018, and Dark Days at Noon, The Future of Fire from 2023. Mr. Struzik has been called upon to speak on wildfire in wide-ranging locales from UCLA, the LA Times Book Festival, Wildfire Summit in California, to smaller, more remote places, just as Whitehorse in the Yukon, Campbell River, Powell River, Salt Spring Island in BC, and Portland, Maine. In 2018, he briefed U.S. congressional staffers on wildfire. He's been a keynote speaker at meetings of the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers, the Conference Board of Canada, the Insurance Bureau of Canada, the Wildfire Summit in California, the Center for Social and Environmental Accounting Research at Ryerson University, Festival of Ideas in Winnipeg, and the University of Trenton in Italy. In 2023, he was the distinguished speaker at the University of British Columbia's annual lecture series. So welcome, Ed.
Thank you. Can you see my screen? All right, great. Well, thanks for inviting me. So wildfire is really very simple. It's the story of climate change. When Europeans first began settling in North America, there was not a lot of fire on the landscape. And that's because they came in the middle of the Little Ice Age, which lasted from around 1300 to 1825. And that's when temperatures were about 2 to 3 degrees Celsius cooler than they are now. And so lightning strikes, which today account for a significant number of fires, would have been less frequent because heat is needed to create lightning. And when lightning did trigger a fire, the flames would not have spread far in cool, wet weather that prevailed back then. And then we also had a lot of wetlands that came with deglaciation, and they would have stopped or slowed a fire if one was started by lightning. But then the Little Ice Age ended around 1825 when a lot of people started migrating across the ocean to the New World. And more heat in the atmosphere almost certainly resulted in more lightning. There's this loosey-goosey equation that for every 1 degree increase in temperature, you have about 10%, 12% more lightning. So they would have seen a lot more lightning as in the years after they first settled. And so these early settlers had no experience with big fires that came with more lightning and warmer, drier weather. Consider where they came from. You know, these were pasty-faced English people, Irish people that lived in, very wet, cool climates. Germany as well. It was, and they came out of an ice age environment. And they had no fire brigades back then. So fire was really, big fires would have been a novelty to them. So when a big fire like the Miramichi fire, which still is the biggest fire in North American history, came to New Brunswick and Maine in 1825, chaos and panic ensued. And this comes from someone that actually saw what happened. So those fortunate enough to be near a river took refuge in the water, often trying to coax their cows and pigs with them. The livestock were panicked by the smoke and the flames and refused to enter. Most of them succumbed to the heat and smoke. Wild animals had no such fear of water. The humans in the river found themselves surrounded by wildlife, including raccoons, deer, bears, and even large moose. I would love to have seen that. So destructive fires such as Miramichi occurred with more frequency as the climate continued to heat up, as the forest started to dry up, and as wetlands were drained away to make way for farms and cities. Think about it, that in about the first 100 years after settlement, we drained in Canada the equivalent of about the size of California wetlands to make way for agriculture. And big fires followed in the Saguenay and Ottawa valleys in 1870. Ottawa nearly burned down. The only reason why it didn't was that some engineer, quick thinking engineer, decided to let the water go through the dam and flood the city with water. The Peshtigo Fire of 1871 along the Wisconsin-Ontario border killed 1,200 to 2,500 people. It was the deadliest fire in North American history. And the Thumb Fire in Michigan burned more than 1,000,000 acres and killed 282 people in 1881. Some bodies were reportedly found in a kneeling position as if they died while praying for salvation. And this is how the Red Cross got started in America. There were so many injured people that the Red Cross, which originated in Europe, set itself up in America. We had the Hinckley Fire in Northern Ontario. Fernie in BC burned in 1908 for the second time in 5 years. And then the Great Fire of 1910, nearly 2,000 fires were smoldering in Idaho and Montana when hurricane force winds blew in, and daytime darkness descended on cities from Saskatoon to Denver. Ships that were 800 kilometers at sea could not navigate by the stars. 86 people died, 3 million acres burned in just 2 days. And what we haven't realized until fairly recently is that southern Alberta burned at the same time. And it was a really big catastrophic fires. And of course, they had no fire brigades at that time either. It was essentially ranchers and farmers and people from Calgary coming in to try to save people. And if you look at this map that was recently published, look, this is how big the fires were, how big an area it covered. Everything in black is where the fires were. So it extended right to the north end of Waterton Lakes, right up east of Banff National Park. And then we had the Porcupine Wildfire of 1911, at least 200 people dead and 500,000 acres burned. So where did these fires come from? Well, obviously lightning was responsible for some of them because it was getting hotter and drier, and you would expect to see more lightning. But farmers were responsible for many of these fires because they brought over with them this idea is that, you burn forest, you burn your slash, and they didn't anticipate that these fires could get away in a boreal forest, which we know would make sense now, but to them, it would have been something would have stopped it along the way. In the 1890s and early 1900s, fires were frequently ignited by chimney sparks from wood and coal burning locomotives or by live coals that the railway companies dumped onto the railway right of ways. They didn't wait to see whether or not that they would start a fire or not. They just chugged along. And everybody knew what was going on. The Globe in September 1910 had this editorial. It is the railways that spread most of the destruction. The sparks from their locomotives start numerous fires that gain great headway before they are detected. In 1910, R.H. Campbell, the chief of forestry for the branch of the Interior Department, urged action by the Justice Department to stop this and advocated that they be fined and be forced to cover the damages caused by these fires. But the prime ministers at the time, Macdonald and Laurier, were more beholden to the railway companies, as we know from Pierre Berton's book and other historical references. They had a big investment in the railway. It was the national dream, and they weren't going to take down the railway companies because they were starting hundreds of fires. Instead, the government blamed Indigenous people. And it just in my book, I point out just how often and in how many inventive ways they did this, that they were largely responsible for the fires. And Bernard Furneaux, the board member on the Commission of Conservation for Canada, he saw wildfire as the worst enemy and forested crops that needed to be harvested, not burned. And conflagrations or fires are due largely to bad habits and loose morals. Think about that. So a series of measures were taken to deal with the issue. the first thing we did was we kicked Indigenous people out of national parks because they used fire as a landscape tool. And that started in 1885 in Banff National Park and went right over to Riding Mountain National Park, where they actually escorted Indigenous people who lived in the park at the time. And then to make sure that they didn't come back, they burned their homes down, their cabins down, and told them to look around back at the smoke to say, don't come back because there won't be anything there for you. And so once we got rid of the Indigenous people, a more organized, institutionalized forest fighting strategy was put into place. And I should just put this into context with the Indigenous people is that they lit fires in order to clear the land, to grow grass for bison, to have more sunlight that would expose the rays of the sun for the growth of root vegetables and berries. So there was a strategy. There was a reason why they did this, and they tended to burn in the shoulder seasons when a fire was not likely to spread very far. So we built fire lookouts to detect fires. Heliographs were used by rangers to send fire messages by means of a mirror and the sun's rays. Later on, portable phones were used to communicate the location of a fire, and we set up wildfire control centers to dispatch fires to those places where there were fires on foot, on horse, by truck, by train. We had boats on the Athabasca and Mackenzie rivers. Royal Canadian Air Force was deployed to find fires, and they did this. They would just fly out to the boreal forest and they would see this plume of smoke, and then the ground crews, if they were in the area, were told approximately where it was, and the guy in the back seat would drop a roll of toilet paper down, and that was supposed to signal where the fire was. I'm not sure how the effective that was, but I thought that was kind of inventive thinking. And then we started to parachute firefighters into fires. And at one point we also enlisted beavers. And this was an idea that started in Idaho and got into Wisconsin. I don't think it ever came to Canada, but somebody got the idea is that there was no water available where there was a lot of fires, and that beavers were pretty good at creating reservoirs of water. So what they did was they trapped a whole bunch of beavers, and they decided to take them out to the backcountry to do their work. The first mistake was they realized is that donkeys and beavers don't get along. So they decided instead to fly them out and parachute them in. So that's how the word Geronimo got into place. And this one beaver, Geronimo, made 5 test flights. And they flew him in a wooden crate, dropped him in a parachute with the idea that either the crate would break open, and if it didn't, the beavers would chew their way out. I thought it was a brilliant idea. In 1937, Ferdinand Silcox of the U.S. Forest Service came up with a 10 a.m. policy. It was a directive that demanded that all wildfires, regardless of how remote, be brought under control by 10 a.m. the next day following discovery. And Canada adopted that strategy in the national park and in Alberta. And unemployed men during the Depression were hired to fight fires. We had thousands of them out there fighting fires. Smokey the Bear became the symbol of fire in North America, but Alberta decided, no, we wanted our own symbol, and we had Birdie the Beaver. I think very Canadian in a way. The only thing that nobody really talks about is that they hired the Walt Disney Company to create Birdie the Beaver. Parks Canada was so successful in suppressing fire in the Rocky Mountain parks that the annual area burn from 1945 to 2015 was reduced to 3% of the previous long-term average. That's why when you drive down the Icefield Parkway and you see this beautiful stand of pine and spruce trees, from Jasper to Banff, basically they're 80 to 100-year-old trees that haven't seen fire. Problem is that fire suppression could not keep up with a warming world. And we had, I think the turning point in my mind, I think there were many, you could argue about this, but for me, it probably was the 2000 fire season, where it started off with a fire that erupted in Kootenay National Park and shut down the highway for pretty much most of the summer. And I was actually on that fire, and I couldn't figure out why the firefighters were calling it the holy shit fire. And when I got brave enough and got to know everybody enough, they said, well, when we saw this fire, chugging down the valley, by helicopter, everybody just said, holy shit. So that was the name that was given. And that same summer, we wasn't the biggest fire season ever, but it was a season in which fire, where humans were in harm's way, for the first time ever, really, in a big way. We had 2,000 people were forced to evacuate Crow's Nest Pass for most of the summer. 25 fires burned 13% of Glacier National Park along the Montana-Alberta border, just sparing Waterton Lakes. In Idaho, 2 firefighters died. In the Cascade Mountains of Oregon, 1,000 people were forced to evacuate as 2 fires converged. At one point, there were more than 2,000 firefighters on the scene, supported by 113 pumper trucks and 14 helicopters. And President George Bush, when he was brought in to have a look, he said, it's a Holocaust. The Syncline fire in Jasper National Park was a prescribed burn that got out of control. And had it not been for a rather daring strategy by the firefighters in Jasper at that time, it may have actually burned all the way to Hinton. Town of Banff was threatened on 2 fronts during the height of the tourist season. Fires burned so hot in Wood Buffalo National Park that the U.S. Naval Defense Research Lab thought that the plumes of smoke they detected in the stratosphere were coming from a volcano because they didn't believe that fire could produce that much energy. We had 45,000 people forced to evacuate their homes in British Columbia. Triage became the order of the day. We did not have enough people, planes, and machinery to be able to deal with all of those fires. So if people were not in harm's way, especially in British Columbia, they just said, okay, let it burn. And York Factory National Historic Site, they called on Parks Canada to help because they had a fire that was threatening to burn down this National Historic Site. And it was also threatening to burn the denning grounds of polar bears on western Hudson Bay, where's Wapas National Park. And these are the only bears in the world, polar bears in the world, that actually travel up to 80 kilometers inland to den and give birth in the boreal forest. All bears in the rest of the world, polar bears in the rest of the world, den in snowbanks. And I was involved in a survey to see whether or not those fires in 2003 had actually destroyed some of the dens. It was the following winter, and it was bloody cold. It was about minus 30, 35 degrees. But I was absolutely determined to get into one of these dens, and I talked to the biologist and the helicopter pilot to land nearby, make sure that there were no polar bears in the area, and we saw that looked like the den had been evacuated or abandoned, and the bear and their cubs were on their way to west coast of Hudson Bay. And so when we landed, I got to go inside a polar bear den. I know this has got nothing to do with my talk, but I thought I'd add a little bit of levity to this. So I crawled in there, had a look, and thought, oh, this is just great. And then when I got back into the helicopter and we started to take off, the helicopter pilot kept poking me and pointing in the distance and pointing in the distance. And I couldn't figure out until I saw, and you may be able to see if you look at the center scene, the middle tree, there was the polar bear hiding behind the tree the entire time. So I was a very lucky boy that day. So Rob Walker, who was the head of fire and vegetation for Parks Canada at the time, said to me that year that at the end of that fire, that the 2000 fire season was a harbinger of what we might expect in a rapidly warming world. And I have to admit, it really didn't sink in until the events that followed, because each year brought something new and really disturbing and often head spinning. 2004, we had a record number of fires on the Yukon, Alaska. It burned an area the size of Vancouver Island. In 2007, fire burned more than 1,000 square kilometers of tundra on Alaska's North Slope, where you never expect fire to burn. We had Slave Lake fire in 2011, where the entire town was evacuated, and that fire came into town like a horizontal corkscrew. It burned all the buildings on one side, and it seemed to take a breath and let the buildings on the other side stay safe, and then continued to burn the city, all the buildings on the other side. In 2014, most of the southern half of the Northwest Territories was on evacuation alert. And in 2015, a slow-moving thunderstorm that produced very little rain produced 62,000 lightning strikes in 5 days and triggered 286 fires. If you can imagine, nobody had seen anything like that. Then we had the Horse River fire in 2016, which was the fire for the ages because 88,000 people were forced to evacuate. But something that we saw that really, I think, was unexpected was the pyrocy B, and it's a cryptic name, and it's an abbreviation that scientists didn't use before 2005. And these storms are both conventional and counterintuitive. A pyro CB can spawn on a blue sky day. All that happens is that there's so much heat and energy coming from that fire that it sucks up all the moisture and creates basically a dirty thunderstorm cloud. And it can produce lightning, it can produce hail, and it can actually spawn tornadoes. What it generally does not do is drop any rain. And we had four pyro CBs during the Horse River fire, and one of them shot out lightning 30 kilometers away from the fire front and ignited a cluster of fires 30 kilometers away. You can imagine that. It's sort of like dragons in the forest. So at this point, I just want to remind, everyone here is that fire is really an important process. The heat of a wildfire is needed to open up a pine or spruce cone so that it can release its seeds. It's crucial for forest regeneration. I can remember Charles Wood, a former Cree chief at Saddle Lake, telling me one time why fire was so important and how they embraced fire. And he said, he pointed to a spruce tree that was 80 or 90 years old. And he said, when the boughs are so close to the ground, it means that the tree is telling us, I'm old, I'm tired, I'm ready for that grass fire to come and burn me so that, the forest can be regenerated. I thought that was rather cool. And, following a fire, bears and other animals feed on animals killed by a fire. We got black fire beetles move in to lay their eggs on warm stumps. Nighthawks and woodpeckers come in to feed on the beetles. Owls nest in the snags, feeding their chicks rodents in more exposed and fire-scarred areas. And then aspen shoots rise up really quickly after a fire. You can see this aspen shoot rising up, and the forest floor is still smoldering. And then elk and bison move in to feed on the aspen shoots, and grizzly bears fatten up on root vegetables and berries that thrive in burned out areas where the sun is able to shine through to the ground. So it does have its benefits. It's absolutely necessary. It's part of the boreal forest ecosystem. But the problem is wildfires are spreading faster, burning hotter and longer, and sending smoke higher into the atmosphere and killing a lot more trees than it ever has in the past. We had the Keno fire in Waterton in 2018, which was unprecedented in the region's history, which dates back to 1700. 80% of the burn area was of high to very high severity. And look what happened a year after that fire is that they had a big thunderstorm that dropped a lot of rain and swept up all the carbon, poured it into the Cameron River, and you can see the difference. Cameron Falls on the right side, which is normally crystal clear, and then just turned black with carbon. And it really could affect drinking water. Disease and insects such as the mountain pine beetle are ravaging older forests that would have otherwise been regenerated and made more resilient by fire. In 2010, Dave Smith invited me to come along on a helicopter survey in Jasper to see whether the mountain pine beetle was coming in from BC. We counted 400 trees that had been infected. Currently, there are more than 62,000 acres of the national park's forest that are infected. I was in Greenland in 2018 when it burned. It had never burned before. And Australia burned like it never did before. An estimated 3 billion animals, the vast majority being reptiles, were affected. They had 18 pyro-CBs that erupted between December 29th and January 14th. It was a meteorological show like nothing ever seen before. The largest of plumes in Australia exhibited several previously undocumented phenomena. No other fire in history had sent so much smoke to heights of up to 16 kilometers. No other plume had exhibited such a remarkable lofting. One plume rose from 15 kilometers to 30 kilometers. It was 5 kilometers thick and 1,000 kilometers wide. It traveled east from Australia to South America before reversing course in January and completely circling the globe westward over the next few weeks. It actually reduced global temperatures by more than half a degree for 6 months. And it wasn't so much of the ash that caused that cooling, it was the physical modification of the cloud cover that came with it. And then 2021, we had 10 pyro-CBs erupt on the Manitoba-Saskatchewan border. And it just continues with the 2021 fire season was the third largest after 2017 and 2018. In 2022, we had 37 fires still burning in mid-October in the subarctic of the NWT when there's almost always a foot of snow on the ground. And one of those fires burned down this research station that I'd visit. And as we all know, 2023 was the worst fire season ever. Fires burned in every province but PEI and every territory except Nunavut. So how will this play out in Edmonton? We can discuss this, but the fact is the river valley is not what it was in the 19th century, when Indigenous people lived in the river valley and they burned. And it was more grassland, parkland than it was with those beautiful spruce trees that I see looking out my window on Saskatchewan Drive. And most of the city's wetlands have been drained. Everything that you see on that screen there is wetlands and lakes and rivers and streams that have been either diverted or drained for urban development. River valley trees are mature, stressed, or dying because of heat and drought. One agrologist at the University of Alberta told me that 50% of the aspen in the river valley are dead or about to die. We've had 28 major events over a 6-month period in 2024. I reported one of them below my house on Saskatchewan Drive, and I talked to the firefighters, and they told me that it's not a matter if a wildfire is going to come through Edmonton, it's a matter of when. And River Valley communities are vulnerable. There's no question about it, and unprepared, as I am in this house. This is the view of my neighbor's house and garage next door. So if you can imagine, we're right next to the river valley. You can imagine what might happen then. My neighbor has cedar shingles. I have got cedar siding. I've got ornamental junipers at the front of my house and a stand of 80-year-old spruce in front of my house. I'm in harm's way. In June, I was in the Santa Barbara Mountains around Los Angeles doing some hiking, and it was all lush. It was wonderful. You think fire's not going to come here. 6 months later, this is what it looked like. So, what's the past tell us about the future? If you look at all the lighter colors, the yellow, the whites, that's all the fires that we've seen in the last decade. The potential for an extreme fire could quadruple by the end of the century across Canada and more than 10 times more often in the boreal forest area. That's according to a recent report by the Canadian Forest Service. This is boreal Canada. So business as usual is not going to be successful. And we should be learning lessons from Jasper, because Jasper started preparing for fires 10, 12 years ago. I mean, they were thinning the forest around the town site and in the town site. They were doing prescribed burns, and fires still came. But, as the mayor pointed out, is that it probably would have been a lot worse had they not done their work. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Ed. So that really helps set the context for how the probability is increasing.
Yeah, we might be able to slow this down, but we're going to have to learn to live with fire, and it's going to take because temperatures are not going to get they're not going to drop. It's going to get hotter and it's going to get drier. We're going to have maybe seasons like last year that maybe are not as severe, but then another 2023 is going to come along. So I just think that we're just going to have to learn to live with fire. One thing, our river valley distinguishes us from the rest of North America. And the long history is always is pointed out is the one thing that people cherish most. And I think that we're losing it incrementally for development, for draining of wetlands, and wildfire is also going to be a factor. I think we've got to better integrate our river valley communities and the people who live in them with what's going on in the river valley. Uh, there are tremendous benefits of maintaining mature communities like mine, where we do have this. I think I see us as a bit of a buffer zone between the valley, and we've got deer, coyotes, many birds come up into our neighborhood. And I think one of the problems with the city right now is that they've got rid of the term mature neighborhood. We really have to have a more integrated, sensible approach and have communities understand how they're vulnerable to fire, what they can what they can do to make themselves resilient, more resilient to fire. For example, it used to be, bark used to be a wonderful way to preserve moisture in your soil around trees. But at the same time, as we learned from Fort McMurray, that's basically like just fuel for a fire to get to those trees. Um, Planting, ornamental cedars around your house is probably not a good idea because they burn really well. Junipers as well. There's a lot of landscaping that you can do that may be more conducive to attracting birds and butterflies and bees and whatnot. So it's a more holistic approach, but I think people like me are longing to better understand what we can do. My wife has planted a wild garden, and we're getting hummingbirds, we're getting bees, but we also need guidance. And I think the city could do more of that through the community leagues, which is another thing about Edmonton, which I think is distinguishes itself from the rest of the country. Community leagues can be a powerful way of educating the public, and we've got to maybe get them on side of this issue in a more meaningful way.
So that kind of brings the talk to a close. Real eye opener, Ed, especially how you built the history of how fire has come about because of our changing conditions. It's not just all of a sudden, something in the last few years. It's building, and so it's not an event that's going to go the other way. It's getting more extreme. So we have to be conscious and respectful of that, and then the second thing is, and Edmonton's got an extremely large river valley, as we've talked about. It's a hallmark and a sense of pride, but it's also at this point a bit of a liability if we don't have a plan out of how to manage and work with what we know is an inevitable. There's that strong potential for fire. And then the other aspect I thought was really important that you brought up was part of the planning is involving the strong community leagues, getting the message out and doing proactive preventative things like suggestions and advice for landscaping and for other inputs into long-term city planning. Those instruments that the city uses as part of the planning, fire preventativeness should be a part of that too. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks. I appreciate it. Yeah. Yeah, it was wonderful. Thank you for inviting me, and good luck with all your work. It's really important.
Thank you very much, Ed.
Okay, take care.
Thanks. Bye now.